The night air was crisp as he stepped out of his luxury penthouse, dressed in simple, worn-out clothes. No one would have recognized him. His name was known across the business world, a billionaire with influence, power, and wealth beyond imagination. He had built an empire from the ground up, turning ideas into fortune, yet something inside him felt empty. For years, he had been surrounded by luxury, expensive cars, private jets, and lavish parties. He had everything most people could only dream of. But the more he gained, the less it seemed to matter. His days were filled with meetings and deals, yet his life felt disconnected from reality. He often wondered what life was like for those at the bottom, those who had no safety net. People who didn't have millions sitting in their bank accounts, who struggled just to make it through the day. He had donated to charities, sponsored shelters, and written checks. But he never truly understood the people he was helping. That night, something inside him told him to see for himself. Not as a billionaire making a public gesture, but as an ordinary man. No cameras, no assistants, no one knowing his real identity. With just a few bills in his pocket, he left his expensive watch behind and stepped into the streets. He walked past people who would normally stop to shake his hand, but tonight, no one paid attention to him. He wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was just another face in the crowd. As he approached the doors of the homeless shelter, he hesitated for a moment. Then, taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, unsure of what he was about to experience. As he stepped through the shelter's doors, the atmosphere hit him immediately. It was warm inside, but not in a comfortable way, more like a crowded space, filled with people trying to escape the cold outside. The air smelled of old blankets, canned soup, and exhaustion. He looked around, taking everything in. Some people sat hunched over on worn-out chairs, their faces tired, their eyes heavy with unspoken pain. Others stood in small groups, chatting quietly, sharing stories of how they ended up here. A few volunteers moved between them, handing out plates of food and offering soft smiles. No one glanced at him twice. No one recognized him. To them, he was just another homeless man looking for shelter. A volunteer at the front desk waved him over. "Need a place to sleep?" she asked, her voice kind but tired. He nodded. "Yeah, just for the night." She handed him a thin blanket and gestured toward the far side of the room. "Find an open spot. Dinner's still being served if you're hungry." He thanked her and walked deeper inside, his shoes scuffing against the old linoleum floor. The billionaire had expected to feel like an outsider, but instead, he felt invisible. He passed an older man sitting alone, staring at his hands as if they held the answer to a question only he understood. A young woman sat with a little boy, rubbing his back as he dozed off against her. Then he spotted an open chair at a long table where a few men were eating. He hesitated, then sat down. The man across from him, middle-aged with a scruffy beard, gave him a nod before taking another bite of his bread. "You new here?" the man asked. "Yeah," the billionaire said simply. The man smirked. "You'll get used to it." The billionaire nodded, but he wasn't sure he would. He had spent his life in places where power and wealth opened every door. But here, none of that mattered. Here, he was just another person trying to get through the night. The billionaire sat quietly at the table, listening to the quiet murmur of voices around him. The man across from him took another bite of his bread, chewing slowly before speaking again. "Name's Rick," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Been coming here on and off for a couple of years. What about you?" The billionaire hesitated. He had introduced himself with confidence in business meetings, at elite gatherings, on stages in front of thousands. But here he wasn't a billionaire. He was just another face among the forgotten. "Daniel," he finally said. It wasn't a lie. It was his real first name, just one no one usually used. Rick nodded. "What's your story?" The billionaire paused. He had spent his life telling stories about success, about how he had built his empire from nothing. But those stories didn't belong here, so he turned the question around. "What about you?" Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, where do I even start?" He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. "Used to have a good life. A wife, a house, a business, ran a small construction company, wasn't rich but we got by." He exhaled sharply, his expression darkening. Then the economy crashed. Lost a couple of big contracts, couldn't keep up with payments, ended up losing everything. Wife left, took the kids, I tried to start over, but... He shrugged. Once you hit rock bottom, climbing back up isn't as easy as people think. The billionaire listened, the words sinking in. He had seen the numbers, the statistics. He had read about people losing everything in economic downturns. But hearing it firsthand made it real. A woman sitting nearby joined in. "You think that's bad?" she said with a bitter laugh. "I ran from my husband before he could kill me. Ended up here with nothing but the clothes on my back." The billionaire turned toward her. She looked to be in her late 30s, her eyes tired but sharp. "They tell you to leave, but they don't tell you how," she continued. "You think I wanted this? Living in shelters, eating food from donations? I had no choice." The table fell silent for a moment. Then, a young man, barely in his 20s, cleared his throat. "I grew up in foster care," he said quietly. "When I turned 18, I had nowhere to go. No money, no family, no home." The billionaire's stomach tightened. He had built programs to help young entrepreneurs, invested millions in business startups, but he had never thought about kids aging out of the system with nowhere to turn. The stories kept coming, each one a thread in a web of struggle he had never truly seen before. These people weren't lazy or weak. They had simply been dealt hands that were impossible to win. For the first time in his life, the billionaire realized how little he actually understood about the world outside his wealth. The billionaire sat in silence, their words still echoing in his mind. He had built his life on the belief that hard work and smart decisions led to success, that anyone could rise if they just tried hard enough. But here, in this shelter, he was seeing something different. These people weren't lazy, they weren't failures, they had tried, they had fought, and yet, they had still lost. Rick leaned forward, studying him. "You're quiet, man. What's on your mind?" The billionaire hesitated before answering. "I guess I never realized how easy it is to lose everything." Rick let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, one bad break, one mistake, and it all comes crashing down." He shook his head. "People love to judge from the outside. They think we're here because we messed up, but sometimes life just decides for you." The billionaire thought about that. He had always credited his success to his own hard work, and yes, he had worked hard. But he had also been lucky. He had been in the right place at the right time. He had connections, safety nets, second chances. Not everyone had that. He glanced around the shelter again, really looking this time. He saw people who had once been teachers, business owners, parents, people who had dreams just like he had. Now they were struggling to find their next meal. The woman who had escaped abuse spoke again. "The worst part isn't the hunger or the cold," she said. "It's feeling invisible. Like the world doesn't even see you anymore." The billionaire swallowed hard. He had walked past people like them before, never really looking, never really thinking about their stories. A young man at the table shook his head. "You want to know what's funny? I actually used to think like the people who judge us, thought homeless people just didn't try hard enough. Then I ended up here. Turns out, life doesn't care what you think." The billionaire exhaled slowly. He had spent years making billion-dollar decisions, shaping industries, influencing economies, but he had never been as humbled as he was in this moment. It wasn't just about money. Success wasn't just about effort. Some people fell through the cracks, no matter how hard they fought. For the first time in his life, he saw the world through different eyes. He had lived at the very top, surrounded by wealth, power, and privilege. Now, for a brief moment, he was at the bottom. And it changed everything. The billionaire sat quietly, absorbing everything. He had come here expecting to listen, to understand. But now, he felt something more. A need to do something. He glanced at Rick, who was picking at the last bit of food on his plate. The conversation had moved on to lighter topics, but the weight of their struggles still hung in the air. "Do you ever try to get work?" the billionaire asked. Rick sighed. "Of course, but once you hit a certain age, no one wants to hire you. And without an address or clean clothes, good luck getting past an interview." The billionaire nodded. He had never thought about that. He had always hired the best, polished, experienced professionals. But what about those who were capable but had nowhere to start? The young man who had aged out of foster care spoke up. "I tried applying for jobs, but they always want experience. How do you get experience when no one gives you a chance?" The billionaire thought for a moment. Then, carefully, he said, "What if someone helped you with that? Helped you write a resume, maybe showed you how to answer interview questions?" Rick chuckled. "That'd be great, but who's gonna do that?" "I could," the billionaire said. The table fell silent. The billionaire leaned forward. "I used to run a business," he lied. Well, not exactly a lie, but an understatement. "I know what employers look for. I can help." The young man's eyes widened. "Seriously?" The billionaire nodded. "Yeah, I mean if you want." For the next hour, he listened to their skills, helping them shape their experiences into something employers might value. He showed Rick how to highlight his years of construction work. He helped the young man put together a plan to apply for entry-level jobs. He didn't have to do this. He could have written a check, made a donation, but this felt real. And for the first time in years, the billionaire felt something unfamiliar. Not power, not success, but purpose. As the night stretched on, the billionaire found himself deep in conversation with the shelter's director. She was a woman in her 50s, with tired eyes, but a determined spirit. "You're new here," she said, studying him. He nodded. "Yeah, just trying to get by." She smiled knowingly. "We get all kinds. Some stay for a night, some for months. Everyone's got a story." The billionaire hesitated before asking, "How do you keep this place running?" Her smile faded. "It's not easy. We rely on donations, but it's never enough. We turn people away sometimes, and it kills me," she sighed. "Food, medical care, job training, it all costs money. Some nights, I wonder how much longer we'll last." The billionaire felt a strange weight in his chest. He had never worried about money, not once. His biggest decisions involved where to invest millions, which luxury property to buy next. But here was a woman fighting every day just to keep the lights on for people who had nowhere else to go. "Ever thought about asking bigger donors for help?" he asked carefully. She let out a small laugh. "You think I haven't tried? Most people want to write a check and feel good about themselves. They don't really see us." The billionaire swallowed hard. He had been one of those people. He had donated to shelters before, large sums, tax-deductible, handled by his assistants. But he had never set foot in one. Never understood what that money actually did. Now he saw it. The shelter wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a lifeline. A second chance. And without it, people like Rick, the young man, the woman who had escaped abuse, they wouldn't just struggle, they wouldn't survive. For the first time in his life, money felt small. This wasn't about business, this wasn't about numbers, this was about people. And he knew what he had to do. The billionaire left the shelter that night with his mind racing. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profits or board meetings. He was thinking about faces, names, stories. Rick, who had lost everything after one financial collapse. The young man, who never got a fair start. The woman, who had escaped abuse only to find herself struggling to survive. The shelter director's words echoed in his mind. "Most people want to write a check and feel good about themselves. They don't really see us." But he saw them now. And he couldn't just walk away. The next morning, he made a quiet phone call. Not to his usual team of assistants, not to his financial advisors. He called the shelter director directly. "This is Sarah," she answered, her voice tired. He took a breath. "I want to help." She paused. "Who is this?" "A friend," he said simply. Over the next few weeks, the billionaire did what he did best, but this time, it wasn't for profit. It was for change. Large anonymous donations started flowing into the shelter, enough to keep it running, enough to expand services, enough to make sure no one was ever turned away again. More than that, he used his influence to create job training programs, connect businesses with workers who just needed a chance. He made sure Rick got a second shot at employment, helped the young man get into an apprenticeship, found resources for the woman to rebuild her life. He never revealed his identity. He didn't want credit, didn't want press. For once, it wasn't about being a billionaire. It wasn't about power. It was about being human. And as he watched from a distance, seeing people get the help they deserved, seeing their lives slowly change, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fulfillment. Not from making another deal, but from knowing that, for the first time, his wealth had truly meant something.